Greetings. At this point, I'm hopeful that you've had a chance to watch those two video lectures encompassing the Kennedy administration. And one thing that I'm hopeful that you're able to take away from that is it was not Kennedy that really kind of came around to the issue of civil rights. It was Kennedy that was forced into that debate. And ultimately, by the end of his presidency, you might even say by the end of his life, he had come full circle. He had chosen sides with the movement. And it is going to involve a more proactive federal government in the realm of civil rights. Now, the fact of the matter is, we don't know what Kennedy's civil rights reform would have looked like, primarily because his life, as well as his presidency, was cut short in Dallas, Texas. We know that Lee Harvey Oswald assassinated John F. Kennedy. And the aftermath of Kennedy's death, it's going to be the individual at the bottom of the screen there that you're looking at, Lyndon Baines Johnson of Texas, that will take the oath of office on Air Force One in Dallas Love Field's tarmac. And Johnson's going to become president. Um, Johnson was added to Jack Kennedy's 1960 presidential ticket primarily to reach out to the American South. As you should know by now, because we've talked about LBJ in this class, he was from Texas. And when it comes to civil rights, he's really a complicated, fickle man. On the one hand, he was a product of his time. There were aspects of Johnson's life, especially early on in his life, that were purely racist. As a matter of fact, if you've been following along in this class, you know that he's going to enter into the Senate in 1948, and he's quickly going to establish himself as a real mover and shaker within the Senate. As a matter of fact, he's going to establish himself as majority leader in the late 1950s, and in that period, he's going to be instrumental in the knocking down of the 1957 Civil Rights Act. Or at least you might even say he was responsible for gutting it. Okay. At the same time, guys, hopefully you remember that Longoria affair, South Texas, Corpus Christi, Texas. Johnson played a very important role in that as well. And that role was the burying of Felix Longoria, this World War II veteran, in the National Cemetery at Arlington. Now, even though he had kind of done the quote unquote right thing and established himself more or less as a champion of civil rights, or at least within the Latino community, he distanced himself because at this particular moment that was shaky landscape, right? To be full circle in support of civil rights. So Johnson is this really, shall we say, unlikely champion of civil rights. And certainly there's going to be a lot of people that are looking at Johnson's presidency, both the year that he'll take over for Kennedy as well as his reelection. They're looking at that with a lot of nerves, and very rightly so. But if there was one thing that Johnson was, he was a shrewd politician. He had what later historians would refer to as the Johnson treatment. He was this big, imposing figure of a man, and when he wanted your support on one measure or another, as leader in the Senate, what he would do is he would put his big catcher's mitt of a paw on your shoulder and get right in your face and ask you, are you sure I don't have your support? Are you positive that we can't find common ground on this issue? What he was really asking them. Are you sure that you want this little dirty secret to go public? Johnson had this black book that had every scandal in Washington, every $100 handshake, and every politician within a 50-mile radius of Washington, D.C. knew exactly what this black book was, and they feared it. And so when Johnson gave people the Johnson treatment, got in their faces a mixture of cajoling and flattering and browbeating and threatening, they knew exactly what it meant. But it worked wonders for getting legislation passed, legislation that would eventually encompass civil rights legislation. We'll talk about what most historians consider to be his major achievement, the Great Society, a little bit later in this lecture. But for right now, I want to talk about how Johnson's going to pick up where John F. Kennedy left off when it comes to civil rights. Bottom line is there's still enormous amounts of pressure on the federal government to do something when it comes to the raw violence that is being inflicted on these not only African American but the broader civil rights community generally speaking. The organizational headquarters for Martin Luther King's Southern Christian Leadership Conference is going to be the 16th Street Baptist Church in Alabama. And it was the Ku Klux Klan that is going to bomb the 16th Street Baptist Church, hoping to get Abernathy, King, some of the leaders of the movement. Well, tragically, the only people that were in the church on that particular morning were four little Sunday school girls, and these four little girls were basically assassinated by the Ku Klux Klan. And so there's still enormous amounts of pressure because this is being beamed into American living rooms nightly. There's enormous amounts of pressure on the federal government to act. And the act is ultimately going to come in the 1964 Civil Rights Act. Johnson is going to play an instrumental role in this legislation because what the Civil Rights Act is going to do is basically forbid segregation and racial discrimination in what you and I would probably call public amenities. Of course, what I mean are things like interstate travel. We've talked about the Freedom Riders before. I also mean things like signs above drinking fountains, seating charts on buses, for stores and institutions like Woolworths, people that sold their products to the broader American public. It meant that you couldn't practice racist policies like not allowing blacks to sit down and order lunch. Generally speaking, what the Civil Rights Act is going to do is it's going to take down that legalization of separate and unequal. It is going to provide full and public access to mainstream American life. And the federal government is going to be the trailblazer when it comes to this. Now understand, Johnson is instrumental in this process that you might not have a Civil Rights Act had it not been for the political talents of LBJ. But understand something else. It's the movement, it's the grassroots direct militant action that's holding Johnson's feet to the fire and forcing him to get involved in civil rights. The crown jewel, if you'd like, of the Civil Rights Act is going to come in the form of the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, which is essentially going to forbid segregation, discrimination in employment. You can't take somebody's race, creed, color, religion, or national origin into consideration when it comes to not only hiring but promotion as well. And really economic advancement is going to be the bedrock of civil rights and the ability to lobby for civil rights. That's certainly what people like Booker T. Washington understood in an earlier time period of civil rights activism. To some extent, you could make the case that Webb Du Bois understood that as well. And in the 1960s, it finally becomes a reality in American life. But the movement is going to keep the pressure squarely on the federal government. Enter into our conversation this massive voter registration drive in 1964 that will come to be known as Freedom Summer. Freedom Summer had been in the works for months and months, and really what it encompassed was a combination of college students throughout the North, primarily in the college campuses in the Midwest, and civil rights activists in Mississippi. And the idea was to have these college students come down to Mississippi and help people in the state of Mississippi register to vote. Now, why Mississippi? Well, when people looked at it was not only one of the most racist states in the country, most thoroughly segregated states, it was also one of the poorest. And part of the reason those activists believed was because it was a one-party ruled state. The Democratic Party was the only party that really mattered, and that was a lily white, exclusively white party. And so the idea was register more African American voters to vote, and you'll change the dynamic of the political landscape, not only in Mississippi, but hopefully the country generally speaking. The only problem, and this goes all the way back to the immediate aftermath of the Civil War, is to just register to vote, let alone actually casting a ballot, would be the equivalent of taking your life into your own hands. It was an act of defiance, and nobody understood this better than a Freedom Summer activist by the name of Fannie Lou Hamer. Fannie Lou Hamer was a Mississippian. She was not one of these college students, but she's an instrumental element of the Freedom Summer initiative. Fannie Lou Hamer is going to give this really famous speech from the floor of the Democratic National Convention in 1964. Now understand something, 64 is an election year, and Lyndon Johnson is running for election. And if you remember from that election of 1960, the South was absolutely essential to the election of John F. Kennedy. And so you can understand from the Democratic Party's perspective, they don't want to do wild things that might isolate the South and get them to move in a direction that might not be all that advantageous to Lyndon Johnson's election prospects in 1964. Bottom line was, Fannie Lou Hamer giving this really important speech was not only controversial, it was seen as the difference of election or defeat in 1964. Fannie Lou Hamer is going to give this speech in Atlantic City, New Jersey, from the Democratic National Convention, entitled, "Is This America?" And what she's asking America is to consider, is this the United States that you know and love, the home of the free and the land of the brave and all that good stuff, where civil rights activists had to sleep with their phones right next to their beds because at any given moment they could be attacked, they could disappear in the middle of the night? Is this America, or is this some sort of police state where you've got freedom and equality for some, but certainly not for all? Now, what she's really driving at is the utter violence that was unleashed on the civil rights movement from the perspective of racist institutions like the Ku Klux Klan. In the midst of this Freedom Summer drive, there's going to be three civil rights workers that are going to be on a voting registration mission, and they're going to go missing one night in the summer of 1964. And when their fellow activists really, you know, begin to dig around what happened to these guys, they come to find out that they had been pulled over, they had been arrested, and then they had shortly thereafter been released. Well, as it turns out, the sheriff's department of Neshoba County, Mississippi, had tipped off the local Ku Klux Klan, who had run them down and assassinated them. This is again this racial violence. This is again what we're talking about the movement being up against in the mid 1960s. And Fannie Lou Hamer's speech demonstrated really two things. Number one, why change is so very necessary, and two, how essential it is to integrate the Democratic Party in Mississippi. Okay? What Fannie Lou Hamer and her fellow activists wanted was a seat at the delegation table, the people that would ultimately nominate the Democratic Party's nominee for president in 1964. And Lyndon Johnson didn't necessarily want to give that to her, because to give what was coming to be known as the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party, an alternative to the exclusively white Democratic Party in Mississippi, to give them access to the delegation table could potentially isolate not just Mississippi, but the rest of the Deep South as well. It had the potential to isolate the entirety of the South, right? Virginia, Arkansas, Tennessee included. And so Lyndon Johnson's very hesitant to do this, and ultimately what we get is a compromise. The Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party will be seated at the delegation. They will have two at-large delegates. And this will result in the Mississippi mainstream Democratic Party boycotting the delegation in 1964. And it came this close to other deep southern states like Georgia and Alabama doing the same thing. Fortunately for the Democratic Party, and especially for Lyndon Johnson, that doesn't happen. But Fannie Lou Hamer's message had reached it out there to the American people. And again, it's demonstrating why change needs to happen, and it's mobilizing support for real, meaningful, sweeping civil rights legislation. 1965 is a very important year. It's an important year because you'll see another element of that civil rights movement really begin to mobilize as well. By 1965, Malcolm X had had this falling out with the Nation of Islam. We remember that Malcolm X had been recruited by the Nation, and the Nation was the leading spokes institution for black separation, the complete separation of the races, and self-determination for the black community. We don't really have time to dig into this. However, if you're interested, we believe that the leader of the nation, Elijah Muhammad, had become very frustrated with Malcolm X for a number of different reasons, and we believe that it was people of the nation that had him assassinated. This comes obviously as a shock to the movement. It was seen as almost a mechanism to decapitate that realm of the civil rights movement. I don't know if you remember Stokely Carmichael. He was this activist within SNCC, and I described him more or less as a thorn in Martin Luther King's side in the sense that he didn't always agree with the brand of activism practiced by MLK. He was much more in favor of a direct, in-your-face, militant brand of activism. And in the aftermath of X's assassination, he'll coin the term Black Power. Now, for your notes, what Black Power was driving at was a very militant brand of civil rights activism. It wasn't just sitting down at lunch counters and refusing to go away until they served you lunch. It certainly wasn't turning the other cheek. If you recall, Malcolm X had kind of advocated this concept of be peaceful with those people that are peaceful with you, but do not allow this racist establishment to beat people up, let alone worse than that. And so it was insinuating violence. It wasn't necessarily advocating it, but certainly it was insinuating it. I think that this idea of a very self-assertive brand of civil rights activism was ultimately misinterpreted. This threat, this insinuation of pushing back, I think was misinterpreted as an excuse to simply be violent or go down the road of violence. You begin to see what I'm talking about here when it comes to the establishment of the Black Panthers. The Black Panthers are going to be founded by a couple activists within Oakland, California, a guy by the name of Huey Newton and Bobby Seale. And ultimately, what they're going to sponsor is a far more militant, at least, vision of African American dissent and protest. Oakland was one of these quote unquote other Americas. We talked about that. It was a black metropolis. It was ravaged by unemployment. It was ravaged by automation and this changing economy. More importantly, for the black community, it was continuously, at least it would have told you as such, harassed by police activity. Police in Oakland, California would routinely comb the streets and they would arrest African American youths for doing something as simple as loitering, right? Hanging out on the street corner. They would throw them in jail and kind of throw away the key. They would not be charged. Their shelf life when it comes to being detained would expire days and days ago, and they would still be left in jail to rot. Clear violations of the most basic levels of civil rights. Bobby Seale and Huey Newton are going to found the Black Panthers to monitor police behavior. Because in the state of California at the time, you could do that. You could take copious notes of a police officer's actions. And considering for a second that the state of California used to be an open carry state, you could do this while wielding a shotgun. If you're following along in the PowerPoint presentation with me, you see exactly that in that Black Panther image down there. And as you might imagine, that was a very different image of black activism during this time period. And one of the individuals that's really taking note is the newly elected governor of the state of California, a guy that I know that you've heard of before, future President Ronald Reagan, who will, as governor, introduce legislation that will transition California away from an open carry state to a much more firearm controlled environment. Well, the Black Panthers assumed that this law was aimed directly at them. and they marched to the state capitol to protest this. Reagan, who was giving an interview to the press at the time, assumed that they were there to assassinate him. These African Americans dressed in black berets and long black trench coats, and so he dove into the bushes. And so this is hitting very close to home to the white establishment, in that these are people that mean business, and you probably don't want to get on the wrong side. And so this different vision of African American protest is going to have some short-term benefits, in the sense that these people do in fact mean business, and you better get really serious about moving forward with civil rights legislation. This brand of civil rights activism, what might loosely be described as Black Power, is really going to catch on in these urban ghettos, places like Chicago, Detroit, Oakland, Los Angeles, and it's really going to be instrumental in the radicalization of the civil rights movement. You'll see what I'm talking about in the next few lectures. For right now, I'd like you to understand that during 1965, 1966, Martin Luther King is going to step up his game when it comes to civil rights activism. Similar to Mississippi, there were civil rights, voting rights activists that were assassinated in 1965. And to kind of pay homage to these people, King organized a march from the site of their assassination, Selma, Alabama, to the state capital of Montgomery. And the governor of Alabama, George Wallace, guaranteed that the Alabama Highway Patrol would protect these people's right to demonstrate peacefully. Well, about the minute that they started to march, they were attacked by those same police officers, right? I mean, they weren't there keeping people away from tearing them limb from limb. They were doing the cracking of heads, so to speak. And again, all of this is being televised. It's all being beamed into people's living rooms. And once again, the combination of, radicalism in places like Oakland combined with police brutality in places like Selma is going to result in civil rights legislation. It demonstrates why change is so necessary. And the result, guys, is going to be the Voting Rights Act of 1965, right? What this will do is it will take aim at states that have a very, shall we say, questionable history of discriminating when it comes to who can register to vote, who has the ability to cast ballots in the democratic process. And certainly Alabama had a very checkered past when it comes to that history. And so what the Voting Rights Act said was, if you want to make it a provision to vote one way or another, you want to make this a new requirement, or that a new provision, any changes would have to be rubber stamped by the federal government in Washington. If you want to make it more and more difficult for this demographic of Americans, Alabamans in this case, to cast ballots, the federal government had to sign off on it first. This is more federal intervention. It's more regulation. It's more government. And it's also guaranteeing more Americans the right to participate in the most basic levels of American democracy, the right to vote. Now, this new right is going to deliver results almost instantaneously. Black voter turnout is going to explode in the aftermath of the Voter Rights Act. And by 1966, certainly by 1968, what you're beginning to see are people of the African American variety being elected into positions of power and authority. I mean, really not since the era of Reconstruction. If you've taken early American history, had you seen this magnitude of results being delivered on the American scale. This really is an accomplishment in the sense that it's empowering a group of Americans who, at this point in time, were pretty powerless. But I want to stop and give props to the people that produced this accomplishment. Of course, it's politicians like LBJ in Washington, but I think the lion's share of that credit should go to the movement, to the grassroots activists, people like Fannie Lou Hamer, people like Martin Luther King, that were willing to sacrifice their bodies, their lives, their freedom to force the federal government into action. Freedom Summer was only ever able to register maybe 3,000 people with the right to vote. But ultimately, what it did was it demonstrated that we're nowhere near out of the woods as far as civil rights legislation. We still have a long way to go. And so, in that respect, it kept the federal government accountable when it comes to implementing these reforms that were so desperately, desperately needed. Understand that it's not just a black and white dichotomy here that we're talking about. And 2,000 miles away from Selma, you're seeing the emergence of another civil rights movement emerge, a movement that we've talked about here and there throughout this course, a movement that is going to involve two really important community activists, Dolores Huerta. If you're looking at the PowerPoint, she's there holding that sign that says UGLA, strike, and of course Cesar Chavez. These individuals were members of a community action program in Southern California, the Delano Valley of California, grape country, wine country. And in 1962, they're going to leave, and what they're going to embark on is at the time an illegal political organization. What they're going to try to do is establish what would later become known as the United Farm Workers Union. And the reason that that's an illegal union is because the Wagner Act of 1935 strictly forbade agricultural workers with the right to form unions. Now, understand that what Chavez and Yorta and the UFW generally want is better work, or better wages, more humane conditions. But just like the Knights of Labor, just like the United Mine Workers in the 1930s, 1940s, what they're also interested in is civil rights. They're a political voice. The UFW is as political as Freedom Summer when it comes to we need an institution that will empower people who are at this point in time pretty powerless. And ultimately, what they're going to take on would be a massive economic interest group, California's wine industry, grape industry. And in 1965, they're going to mobilize for this union recognition by sponsoring a massive grape strike. And the thought was don't buy these grapes. Don't buy California grapes because essentially there was blood on the hands of the grape growers. There were horror stories, just like there were horror stories in Upton Sinclair's meatpacking industry. Now, in the process of this grape strike, trying to get more and more Americans to avoid buying grapes from California, Chavez and Yorta are going to register more than 100,000 new, predominantly Mexican American voters to vote. And these people are going to start voting with their feet. And those political candidates in California and elsewhere that are not really serious about implementing what might loosely be called civil rights are going to be shown the door. In a sense, what the UFW is going to be involved in is what Chicano historians are going to call la causa, the cause, social justice. It's not just about empowering workers. This is also about empowering civil rights activists, that there's a level of social justice, that labor rights, the right that you have at work, labor rights are human rights. Labor rights are civil rights. And this correlation between the two institutions, labor rights and civil rights, it goes back a long, long way. And if you paid attention in this class, it goes way, way back to the late 19th century. The fact that it was perfectly legal to concentrate Jews or Italians in the meanest and nastiest jobs. And certainly that's what some of the earliest unions were involved in addressing, what might loosely be called civil rights campaigns at the same time that they were involved in labor movement campaigns, right? All of this is going to come full circle in 1964, which is an election year. And Lyndon Johnson is going to run for president against a very conservative Republican from Arizona. We're not talking about even somebody like a Richard Nixon. This is a very conservative Republican by the name of Barry Goldwater. And the bottom line was, although there were plenty of American conservatives out there, and certainly they'll make their presence felt here in a few lectures down the road, right now in 64, they're completely disorganized. They're not all on the same page. And Barry Goldwater was, shall we say, an easy political candidate to attack. And Lyndon Johnson is going to blow his doors off. And depending on how you want to slice or dice this is going to be the biggest political landslide in American history. And what Lyndon Johnson is going to use his victory to do is introduce sweeping legislation that was designed not only to address institutionalized racism, but also poverty. Johnson outlines this at the commencement speech at the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor. In 1964, he outlined what would later become known as the Great Society. What I need you to understand about the Great Society is what he's trying to do is bring about not only civil rights, but civil rights through anti-poverty programs sponsored in part by the federal government. Really, this has three parts to it. Number one, we need to focus on the cities. We need to clean up the cities. Michael Harrington's Other America demonstrated how impacted poverty was in the cities. We need to aid the cities. We need to clean up the environment. We're talking about a time period where lakes would literally catch on fire because they were so horribly, terribly polluted. We need more public education. We need it easier for Americans to educate themselves. We need it to be easier for Americans of all varieties to go on to college and to university. And certainly that's going to be a very important cause within Lyndon Johnson's presidency. And you see these results almost instantaneously. The Higher Education Act, it's going to put more federal dollars to send more students that are willing and capable to college and university. It'll be the beginnings of what would later become known as Pell Grants, federal assistance. And let me tell you something really clearly. Had it not been for Pell Grants, I probably wouldn't have graduated, right? You also see the Secondary Education Act, more funding for high schools and things of that variety. You see the Elementary Education Act that's putting more money in the building of construction of elementary schools, the hiring of new elementary school teachers, and the focus on early learners. Get them while they're young, so to speak. You see him begin to introduce anti-poverty programs that you call Medicare and Medicaid. This is health insurance for people that could not get it through the more traditional means. Health insurance for the elderly who would have been excluded if it were not for government-sponsored healthcare programs. People that could not afford to go out there and buy a privately issued insurance plan for one reason or another. This program covers them as well. And so this is addressing poverty in America, and similar to the early 21st century, the lack of healthcare, the lack of options when it comes to people of those varieties, not just them, but especially them, is going to contribute massively to what you and I would call poverty. He also begins to address issues that involve the environment, expands the national park system, puts environmental standardization out there. You can't just choke out as much soot and ash into the atmosphere as you want. You can't dump whatever you want into our rivers, our streams, and our lakes. But one of my favorite projects would be that of the First Lady, Claudia Ladybird Johnson, who's going to sponsor something called the Highway Beautification Project. You drive up and down Texas highways in the early spring, you're going to see blue bonnets. You go up Michigan highways in the summer, you're going to see your tiger lilies, right? These are federally sponsored programs that are going to put flowers, and each state had their own. They're going to put flowers on the side of expressways. So Eisenhower's Interstate Highway Act and initiative, that was great, but it wasn't good enough. These highways need to be beautiful now. And the beautification project is an example of the federal government's attempt and its initiative to clean up the environment. In the mid to late 1960s, the Great Society is going to merge with what Johnson would call his war on poverty. Johnson felt that it was absolutely inexcusable that the richest country in the history of mankind had this level of deeply impacted poverty. And so what he's going to do is he's really going to up the ante when it comes to addressing poverty, generally speaking. More aid to inner cities, an endowment to the arts, similar to Franklin Roosevelt's Federal Arts Project. He's going to put a lot of money to what you and I would probably call public art. One good example is what we call Sesame Street. right? Now, obviously, in the early 21st century, it's a private company, a corporation that owns what you and I call Sesame Street, but it really gets its start through the public broadcasting system, PBS, and PBS got its start through Lyndon Johnson. You begin to see America become more small d democratic when it comes to its immigration policies. The Immigration Act of '65 officially reverses that racist National Origin Act of 1964. There are new programs that Johnson's administration got behind that were designed to help people help themselves out of poverty. One institution that has long since been transitioned into something else, but it's around in some form or fashion, is what used to be called Job Corps. If you were one of these individuals that, on the one hand, didn't necessarily want to go into college, you didn't want to study economics or, biology, maybe you like to work with your hands. After lunch, after you got done with your reading, your writing, and your arithmetic, you were sent to on-the-job training through the Job Corps. You were sent to a carpenter's shop, a mechanic shop, if you wanted to go into that line of work. And what this did is it gave you real world experience that you could market yourself. You had a marketable skill once you hit the job market after high school. And oh, by the way, you had a high school diploma. You were literate. You were a reasonably intelligent individual. Completing high school demonstrated that you could put your nose to the grindstone and complete something to its end. And you also had a trade that set you apart from just any average Joe worker in the economy. VISTA, Volunteers in Service to America. You remember Kennedy's Peace Corps. What VISTA was in the later 1960s was a similar model to the Peace Corps. Instead of sending people to other countries, we sent them to inner city Detroit, inner city Los Angeles, and helped them clean up struggling American communities, best and brightest American minds. And let me end with this lecture by saying this. You do see real meaningful economic progress. We do address poverty in the 1960s. Stay with me. In 1964, when LBJ took over when he was elected, the poverty line was at 20%, meaning that what the federal government defined as impoverished, 20% of American households lived at or below it. By 1968, when he's up for re-election, that number had gone down to 13%. That's meaningful progress. At 7%, we almost cut poverty in half. That's real meaningful progress. To be entirely fair, the 1960s were a very prosperous decade. And you might say that a rising tide lifts all boats, and this expansion of the economy just brought more and more people along for this economic joyride, and certainly that's very relevant. But you also need to understand that these federal programs are changing what it means to be poor in America. Keep in mind that in the Gilded Age, in the late 19th century, if you were poor, if you were Jurgis Rudkis, it was your fault. You were doing something or not doing something, right? What you're getting in this Great Society War on Poverty is the federal government, on the most basic of levels, to acknowledge that in some cases, poverty is just simply beyond the control of various demographics in American life. And we need reforms, regulations, and assistance, a hand up, if you will, to help people move away from poverty. Ultimately, we fail. Maybe fail is a little bit too harsh. Could say that the jury was still out. But Martin Luther King, if you're looking at the PowerPoint here, let's end with this. King had a thought or two when it comes to the issue of the Great Society and the war on poverty. And he said that the Great Society was essentially a casualty of the Vietnam War. And at a time period where a lot of Americans are saying we're spending an awful lot of money on these government programs, and although they have, the goodness of heart and mind, how much good are they doing? We're spending a lot more on this war to keep communism out of Southeastern Asia. A war that seems to go nowhere, a war that we're going to spend billions and billions upon, and that's to say nothing of American lives. You're going to see the radicalization of the civil rights movement. You're going to see people become painfully frustrated with the slow pace of progress when it comes to civil rights. and Vietnam plays a very central role in that element. You'll see what I mean in the next few lectures. For right now, it's been great seeing you again.